The roar of 4 Lockheed C-1130 Hercules aircraft split at 3:47 local time. Their landing lights cut through the perpetual twilight of the Greenlandic spring as ground crews scrambled across the permafrost tarmac of Thule Air Base. Inside the first transport, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division checked their equipment one final time, their breath fogging in the pressurized cabin. None of them knew exactly why they were there. The orders had come down through encrypted military channels 16 hours earlier, flash priority traffic that bypassed standard notification protocols. Wheels down in 90 seconds, the loadmaster announced over the intercom, "Welcome to the new frontier, soldiers." At the Pentagon, in the National Military Command Center, buried beneath 4 levels of reinforced concrete, Admiral James Crawford sat motionless before a wall of displays showing real-time satellite feeds of the deployment. His weathered face, carved by 32 years of military service, reflected the cold blue glow of thermal imaging cameras tracking the movement of C-17 Globemasters across the Atlantic. Beside him, a colonel from the Joint Staff was updating the chairman of the Joint Chiefs via secure video teleconference. "Sir, the airlift operation is currently at Wave 3. We're looking at a total of 110,000 personnel flowing into theater over the next 72 hours. All transportation command assets are now redirected. Commercial air integration protocols are active." The chairman's face on the screen tightened. "And the escalation control measures?" The colonel continued without waiting for a response. "Diplomatic channels remain open. State Department is in continuous contact with allied nations. Russia and China have both filed formal complaints through back channels. The Danes are confused but cooperative. We're maintaining operational security by compartmentalizing the strategic intelligence." What the colonel would not say on a recorded channel, what only a handful of people on Earth knew, was that American intelligence agencies had detected something in the Arctic that fundamentally altered the calculus of global power in ways that would take weeks to become public. 48 hours earlier, signals intelligence teams working out of Fort Meade had intercepted an encrypted communication burst between 2 deep-sea facilities operating beneath the Greenland ice sheet. The thermal signature didn't match any known drilling operation. Neither did the electromagnetic signature. Within 6 hours, the NSA had briefed the Director of National Intelligence, who had briefed the President, who had ordered the largest peacetime military mobilization in the Arctic region in over 2 decades. The speed of the decision-making suggested something far worse than routine intelligence collection. In Moscow, at the Kremlin's newly renovated underground command center, President Dmitry Volkov was receiving similar intelligence from his own reconnaissance assets. The GRU, Russia's main intelligence directorate, had been monitoring American airlift operations for the past 14 hours. Their satellite imagery showed exactly what was happening. What remained unclear was why. Volkov sat at a long table of polished mahogany, his Security Council arrayed before him, their faces a mixture of concern and calculated calculation. "The Americans have moved 110,000 troops into the Arctic in less than 3 days, he said quietly. "No public announcement, no diplomatic notification. They're claiming it's a NATO exercise, but the logistics footprint doesn't match. This is an actual force deployment." General Alexei Sokolov, commander of the Russian armed forces, leaned forward. "Mr. President, we need to consider that this could be a positioning move against our new missile defense network. Our hypersonic test sites in Siberia have been flagged in their intelligence pings before. They could be establishing a forward strike capability." The room fell silent. The weight of that assessment hung in the air like nuclear fallout. In Tokyo, the headquarters of Japan's Defense Intelligence Headquarters, analysts were also working through the implications. Japan controlled strategic choke points in the Pacific that complemented the Arctic as a critical theater of modern great power competition. If the Americans were making a dis-Arctic move, Tokyo needed to understand it immediately. Signals were sent through diplomatic back channels. Taiwan's military intelligence agencies were placed on alert. In Beijing, at the Joint Operations Center in Zhongnanhai, party officials and PLA commanders were receiving updates every 15 minutes. China's own strategic ambitions in the Arctic had accelerated dramatically over the past 18 months, leveraging the warming climate to open new shipping routes and resource extraction opportunities. A sustained American military presence of 110,000 troops represented a fundamental obstacle to those ambitions. Admiral Li Wei, commander of the PLA Navy, had already ordered the Nanshan Group to begin transit toward the Bering Strait. The deployment was not hostile, not yet, but it was deliberate. It was a message. It was, in Chinese military doctrine, a strategic repositioning in response to external provocation. In Kangerlussuaq, a small Greenlandic town of 1,500 residents, the unexpected arrival of American military cargo planes had sent shockwaves through the community. Local fishermen were being asked to evacuate a 30-kilometer perimeter around their traditional hunting grounds. Teachers were receiving notices that schools would be requisitioned for military command post operations. The Danish government, technically responsible for Greenland's Greenland's sovereignty was receiving frantic calls from Copenhagen of whether they had authorized this. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen was on an emergency call with the American Secretary of Defense. "We need clarity on this deployment," she insisted. "Denmark has sovereignty responsibilities in Greenland. Parliament will demand answers." The Secretary of Defense's response was carefully measured. "Prime Minister, this is a bilateral security arrangement between the United States under the defense protocol established by your government last year. We're coordinating with your Ministry of Defense. This is not unilateral action. This is NATO solidarity in the face of emerging Arctic threats." What neither official would acknowledge publicly was that American surveillance systems had detected something beneath the Greenlandic ice sheet that changed everything. Deep-sea reconnaissance platforms, remotely operated vehicles deployed under a cover of routine oceanographic research, had discovered a massive undersea infrastructure project. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't Chinese. It was something far more alarming. A coordinated initiative that suggested a new kind of alliance in the Arctic, one that was moving faster than Western intelligence agencies had predicted. The acoustic signatures suggested advanced drilling technology. The power signatures suggested fusion-based energy systems. The structural echoes suggested things being built at a scale that implied months, or even years, of covert construction. Over the Atlantic, the first wave of heavy-lift transports was making rendezvous with aerial refueling tankers over the mid-ocean. The logistics operation was being orchestrated by U.S. Transportation Command with the precision of a Swiss watch. Each aircraft was loaded with exactly calculated cargo, ammunition, community equipment, medical supplies, cryogenic generators for Arctic operation, advanced radar systems, and something that had been classified with the highest security protocols available modular sections of what appeared to be early warning detection systems designed to monitor electromagnetic phenomena in the polar ionosphere. In the operations center at Thule Air Base, Major Sarah Chen, a career signals officer with a background in aerospace intelligence, was overseeing the integration of these systems into a coherent network. She didn't have the full picture either. Her compartmentation of the mission meant she only understood her piece of the strategic puzzle. But the piece she could see was extraordinary. "We're looking at 38 new sensor nodes being installed across Greenland, northern Canada, and the Arctic archipelago," she told the Joint Task Force commander during a briefing. "Collectively, they'll create a detection grid that can identify metallic objects in orbit down to the size of a coffee can and track atmospheric anomalies that previously fell into our blind spots." The commander, General Marks Webb, nodded slowly. "That's our deterrent posture," he said. "If they can't see us, they can't count on blind spots for their own operations. We're closing the Arctic information gap." The phrase information gap was Pentagon speak for something more sinister. Regions of the electromagnetic spectrum and physical space that were beyond current American surveillance capabilities. Someone, or some combination of nations, had discovered that gap and had begun on operating within it. The discovery had accidental, born from a routine satellite imagery analysis by a National Reconnaissance Office junior analyst named David Morrison. Morrison had been reviewing thermal imagery from Greenlandic glaciers as part of a climate monitoring program when he noticed something anomalous. Power generation signatures consistent with a medium-sized power plant, located at coordinates placed at 1,400 meters beneath the ice. He had flagged it as a potential geothermal anomaly. His supervisor had reviewed it and agreed. It was flagged for higher-level analysis. 3 days later, Morrison received a visit from two men in dark suits who took his security badge, walked him out of the facility, and told him he would receive an unclassified severance package and a permanent non-disclosure agreement. The briefing materials he had been handling were retroactively classified at the highest level. His existence in the system was being quietly erased. What Morrison didn't know was that his discovery had triggered the most comprehensive strategic response the American defense establishment had mounted in the Arctic since the Cold War ended. In London, at the headquarters of Britain's Joint Intelligence Committee, Sir Michael Ashworth was convening an emergency session. The British had their own signals intelligence capabilities and had independently detected the Arctic infrastructure project. The implications were staggering. If advanced foreign actors had established a covert base of operations beneath Greenlandic ice, it suggested technological capabilities and level of secrecy that the NATO alliance could not have failed to detect unless they had been actively deceived. "This isn't just about military positioning," Sir Michael explained to the director of GCHQ. "If they can construct complex facilities undetected beneath ice sheets, what else can they do? What else might already be under construction that we haven't found? This could represent a fundamental shift in our understanding of adversary capabilities." The GCHQ director's response was grim. "We need to assume that this is the tip of an iceberg, figuratively speaking. We need to begin its surveillance of every major ice sheet in the Arctic. If this facility exists, others likely do too. The Americans are deploying to Greenland because they're racing to understand the full scope of the threat before it becomes operational. In Brussels, NATO headquarters was convening an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council. The American ambassador presented satellite intelligence to the assembled representatives of all 32 NATO member nations. The images showed the thermal signatures of the facility. They showed the construction vehicles that had been photographed by reconnaissance drones deployed during the oceanographic research mission. They showed the power transmission systems and the antenna arrays. What they did not show was how long this had been under construction, who had built it. The Danish ambassador asked the question everyone was thinking: is this a Russian operation? The American response was carefully diplomatic. We're still analyzing. What we can say is that the facility shows construction methodologies consistent with advanced Arctic engineering. It's not a military installation in the traditional sense. It appears to be something more specialized. What the Americans were not saying, but what every intelligence service in the room understood, was that the facility appeared to have been constructed with cooperation and coordination, suggested multiple nation-states working in concert. The architectural signatures showed construction techniques from at least 3 different countries. Power systems appeared to have components manufactured in 4 different industrial nations. This was not a unilateral Russian or Chinese operation. This was something far more complex and far more destabilizing, evidence of a coordinated alternative bloc forming in the Arctic, one that operated outside traditional intelligence detection capabilities. By the time the American forces had reached full deployment strength in Greenland, the financial markets of the world had begun to react. Futures markets showed oil prices spiking 15% on speculation about Arctic supply chain disruptions. Defense contractor stocks climbed 8 to 12% based on analysis, suggesting that this deployment represented the beginning of sustained Arctic operations requiring years of sustained logistics. The price of rare earth elements surged because markets were pricing in the possibility of restricted access to Arctic mineral resources. In Moscow, President Volkov was facing pressure from his own military establishment to respond with a symmetrical deployment. The General Staff was recommending a major military exercise in the Arctic that would position Russian forces in visible proximity to the American deployment. The political cost of appearing weak was high. The military cost of escalating would be higher. Volkov chose a middle path, a routine military exercise that with 45,000 Russian troops in Siberia and Arctic regions within 12 days. It was close enough to be threatening. It was deniable enough to be technically not escalatory. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission was calculating similar calculus. The PLA Navy's Nanshan Group proceeded toward the Bering Strait at a steady speed that suggested military training operations rather than provocative action. But the message was clear. China was positioning assets to monitor what Americans and Russians were doing, and implicitly, to ensure that neither bloc could unilaterally dominate the Arctic region. The diplomatic corps were working overtime. Emergency calls were being placed between capitals. Envoys from NATO were holding back-channel negotiations with Russian diplomats in Switzerland. Chinese officials were requesting clarification about the American deployment's true objectives. The United Nations Security Council was called into session, though no formal resolution was proposed. Everyone was probing, testing, seeking to understand the true strategic intent behind the American deployment. What emerged gradually through intelligence briefings and fragmentary information was a picture of technological competition that transcended traditional military concerns. The undersea facility that American intelligence had detected wasn't primarily a military installation. It appeared to be an advanced signals intelligence platform designed to intercept and analyze a specific bandwidth of electromagnetic emissions cut across communications, radar, and satellite systems. The facility's architecture suggested it was part of a larger network, possibly with nodes in other locations that were yet to be discovered. The project appeared to have taken months, or possibly years, to construct. The question that kept policymakers up at night was simple. How long had this operation been underway? What else might be out there? What blind spots did the Western Alliance not yet understand? By the 96th hour of the deployment, all 110,000 American troops were on the ground in theater. The logistics operation had proceeded without incident, though the bandwidth consumption required for command and control had temporarily strained several NATO communication nodes. The sensor network was beginning to come online. Admiral Crawford, still in the National Military Command Center, was watching the first operational feeds from the new detection systems. They showed something remarkable: the ability to track, in real time, the exact position of every airborne object within a 2,000-kilometer radius of Greenland. Aircraft transponders, radar returns, even objects that had been attempting to operate under stealth protocols. The new network was a game changer. It meant that the Arctic information gap was being closed. It meant that future military operations in this region would be visible to American systems in ways that previously had not been possible. In Moscow, Admiral Sokolov was reviewing the same implications. "They're not deploying to attack us," he told President Volkov. "They're deploying to establish persistent surveillance over the entire Arctic theater. They're taking away our ability to operate undetected. We need to accelerate our own countermeasures." The Russian military began implementing protocols to increase the electromagnetic opacity of their Arctic operations. Passive detection systems were being repositioned. Communication patterns were being randomized. New stealth technologies, classified and compartmented, were being rushed to Arctic deployments. The arms race was accelerating in real time. The global strategic balance was shifting beneath the surface of public discourse, playing out in encrypted communications between military commanders and policy makers who understood that the new Arctic theater represented the future of great power competition. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Document leaked through a carefully constructed intelligence network reached a journalist at the Associated Press with connections to the defense establishment. It was a technical specification for the undersea facility. It detailed the nature of the electromagnetic detection system. It specified the countries that had contributed components and funding. The nations listed were not Russia or China. They were medium-sized powers that had traditionally been considered part of the Western orbit: Turkey, Poland, and the Czech Republic. The leak suggested that the Arctic facility was not part of a hostile bloc operation, but rather a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation designed to monitor American surveillance activities. The facilities had been constructed to detect the exact systems that the Americans were now deploying. It was counter-surveillance. It was technological espionage at a scale that suggested cooperation from individuals high within NATO governments. The revelation sent shockwaves through Western capitals. Investigations were launched. Diplomats were recalled. The relationship between the United States and several key NATO allies faced unprecedented strain. The American military establishment realized that the threat in the Arctic was not external invasion or unilateral aggression. It was fragmentation within the alliance itself. It was the emergence of factions and interests that transcended traditional bloc alignments. The deployment of 110,000 troops was not a response to immediate military threat. It was a consolidation move. It was a demonstration that the Arctic was being reclaimed as an American sphere of strategic interest, and that the infrastructure being built there would ensure American dominance in Arctic surveillance, communications, and strategic positioning for decades to come. The financial markets understood this and priced accordingly. The defense contractors that had supplied components for the new systems saw their stock prices climb another 8%. The oil companies began calculating the costs of defending new supply chain routes through Arctic waters. The technology companies considered the implications of a region where communications could be monitored with unprecedented precision. By the time the story began appearing in international news organizations, the strategic situation in the Arctic had been fundamentally transformed. The American deployment had been successful in its primary objective, establishing American military presence and technological dominance in a region that was becoming increasingly central to global great power competition. The Russian military exercises proceeded as scheduled, but they remained non-confrontational. The Chinese naval group took up a monitoring position in the Bering Strait, suggested observation rather than engagement. The NATO allies that had been identified as participants in the undersea facility project faced uncomfortable questions about their loyalties and commitments, but formal expulsions from the alliance were deemed too destabilizing. The geopolitical situation had reached a new equilibrium, one characterized by higher military presence, greater surveillance capability, and deeper layers of strategic competition beneath the surface of official diplomatic protocols. The Arctic of 2026 was no longer a frontier territory. It was a chessboard where the most sophisticated powers on Earth were positioning pieces for a competition that would define international relations for the next generation. The 110,000 troops in Greenland represented an American commitment to ensuring that when the Arctic truly became the central theater of great power competition, as climate change and technological advancement suggested it inevitably would, the United States would be positioned to shape the outcome. The adversaries had been shocked by the speed and scale of the deployment, but they had adapted quickly. The true competition was just beginning, and in the encrypted communications channels between Moscow and Beijing, between Washington and London, between capitals that publicly maintained diplomatic relations but privately competed for Arctic dominance, the calculations had already begun for the next phase of moves in a game where the stakes were not military or conventional military capacity, but in information, surveillance, and the ability to control the technological infrastructure of the polar regions. The Arctic was no longer a distant frontier. It was the future battlefield, and the world's greatest powers had just begun their opening moves in a competition that would define the 2020 2020s and beyond.